GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We just got 2 comments as we went to break from DR Doctor. Would you trade Saquon and Pitts for Josh Jacobs and Dalton Kincaid? That is a very complex trade because I really think that Saquon is primed for a bigger year than people might expect in that Philadelphia Eagles offense. He just adds a versatility to that running back room, alleviates some of the pressure on Jalen Hurts. We might get some touches, but that being said, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are forces to be reckoned with. On every given week, they might find the matchups they like, and they can break out for big games. That's my concern with Saquon. Whereas Pitts is... We get even more and more comments, so we're going to take these all at once. Pitts is a guy who's very talented, but he's an interesting case in that he just hasn't had the QB play yet. So he might be a guy who you're a little bit tentative on. Whereas Josh Jacobs and Dalton Kincaid is a rising star at the tight end position. And Josh Jacobs, we did kind of mention him at the end of last segment, where acquired from Las Vegas, maybe getting out of a very tense situation there. New horizons with Green Bay. That being said, there's just so much wealth to go around, so much to distribute the ball. So I would keep Saquon and Pitts, but it could be one of those trades where you might regret it if you don't go for it. So I'm kind of on the fence here. But from just your comment and being forced to say so in real time, I would say don't accept this trade. And Humanity Unbound says the Bills wide receiver core, I bet. I'm not necessarily going to do a deep dive into the Bills wide receiver core. They're definitely not one of the best in the league right now. But I like their profile. They could be interesting. I like Keon Coleman. Very interesting route runner out of Florida State. And Curtis Samuel has experience. Khalil Shakir kind of had a little bit of a breakout in the latter stages of last season. So the Bills wide receiver core could be an intriguing one. And then the last couple of comments. Well, we had a lot more comments. I had to choose between Kupp or Collins in my dynasty draft. Who would you keep? I would keep Nico Collins. We're going to talk about the Texans wide receiver room a little bit and the trepidations I have there, but I would keep Nico Collins because I still view him as the best wide receiver. And I said it in that wide receiver core, even with Stephon Diggs there. Humanity Unbound said my same thoughts on Barkley. I think that he's agreeing with my sentiment in that I think he's going to have a big role in this Philly offense. And then last but not least, Tap to Learn as well says Jacobs will be a low-end RB1. I kind of disagree with that sentiment. I don't necessarily like the Packers. As Poets, Sears, and Sages says, Jacobs is a beast in the red zone. I don't necessarily think the Packers are a team I think about in terms of utilizing running backs that effectively. I mean, when I think about the profile of this team, especially now, with all the wide receivers we mentioned, I don't see how there's a path forward outside of maybe a couple red zone touches where Josh Jacobs is as effective of a runner as Packers fans might want, because I've seen it before where you just don't get much production, and it's kind of been like that from that transition from Mike McCarthy to Matt LaFleur, where the amount of running plays has steadily declined over the years. So that was a very weird acquisition for me, and he could be interesting. Maybe he gets incorporated into the receiving game as well, but I just don't see it. But thank you all for that flurry of comments right before the break. But I do want to talk about, and not just because I am a fan of them, my Seattle Seahawks. Let's talk about the wide receiver room here. This is a wide receiver room that gets talked about very often as one of either the best in the league or one of the most underrated in the league. There's really no in between. And as a Seattle Seahawks fan, I love that there is so much confusion surrounding this offense because I love every single guy, but there has come a time, and there may come a time where one of these guys may end up leaving or retiring. That's a hint as to what I think might happen in the future for the Seattle Seahawks. But it is one of those wide receiver rooms that we do have to talk about in fantasy context, because it's always going to be one of these guys who you might want to take in, say, the meatier parts of the draft, say the second or third rounds, because of the talent they have there and the upside and value they provide. So without further ado, let's talk about them. Now let's talk about one of the solid citizens in all of fantasy football, DK Metcalf. This guy just gets targets. This is his second consecutive season last year with 1,000 yards, led team in target share, big stat, more than 95 air yards per game with the wide receiver 12 in that regard, wide receiver 6 in yards per reception with 16.9. So DK Metcalf, combined with his power, strength, agility, and speed, is always going to be a guy, maybe not necessarily going to ever break into, say, tier 1, the quote-unquote true superstars of the league, but he's always a guy that a lot of people love in fantasy because of his targets and his wide receiver 1 status in Seattle. But then the questions come outside of the wide receiver 1 position as the competition between the youth and excitement surrounding Jaxon Smith-Njigba and the aging Tyler Lockett is really going to be that point of contention, because Tyler Lockett for many years was highly coveted in terms of fantasy. A lot of people liked him, maybe especially in PPR leagues, got a lot of targets, a lot of catches, but that era and that ship has sailed, I think. I'm sorry to see it because he is a Seattle legend, but I just don't see Tyler Lockett continuing to produce consistently. I believe this is his age 33 season, his 10th in the league. So the Splash Bro says, Geno worries me. Can he do it again? That is also a big factor because Geno is also a very volatile QB. As Humanity Unbound says, Lockett is. I believe he's referring to one of those guys that one of the comment I made concerning Tyler Lockett and his abilities as a fantasy player. I don't necessarily think Lockett is still going to say that, as Humanity Unbound says disregard that actually. But let's get back to the Geno point. He plays a big part in this, right? Because of his volatility. Last year, kind of declined, but in his first year as a full-time starter as a Seattle Seahawk, he did have a good year. And what really excites me about this offense is I'll see Ryan Grubb, and we'll talk about more comparisons with two of the wide receiver rooms, the one I'm talking about now and one that Ryan Grubb worked with as we get into the segment. But let's get back to JSN and Lockett, this competition. JSN, I like JSN a lot because he fit into the slot 64.3% of the time. Very crisp, solid route runner. It's just a matter of getting the ball into his hands. I think the Seattle Seahawks struggle with that regard. And with that regard, I do worry about Geno. Just getting his targets, as Tap Learner says, I flex and wide receiver 2 to Lockett in many a league, generally reliable. Yes, while over the years you can have relied upon Tyler Lockett, I just don't see it this year. I just don't see how we can expect an aging Tyler Lockett to get so many targets in this offense. And to further add on to that point, with a wide receiver 71 in yards per reception with only 11.3. So we have seen the decline of Tyler Lockett, and while it's sad as a Seattle Seahawks fan to see that, he will truly be a Seattle legend no matter what happens in his career. I just don't see how he's going to factor into this offense. Let's talk about JSN. Over the years, yes, underrated and consistent, says Humanity Unbound. So I can agree with that. Over the years, he has been a very underrated receiver. But this year, I think that we're going to see a decline that I feel like I knew was coming. But I do want to talk about a comparison I just alluded to. Because new offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb comes from in-state, the University of Washington. And when I think about wide receiver rooms from college football that can compare to an NFL wide receiver room, the Seattle Seahawks and the 2023 University of Washington wide receiver rooms are very similar. DK, much like Rome Odunze. Fantastic in the catch point, a lot of power, a lot of ball control as well. Fantastic route runner, whether vertically down the sidelines, uses his intelligence and IQ to get open. Then I look at JSN. more like a Jalen Polk in that he's a very savvy route runner. He's always going to be very crisp. And then Tyler Lockett kind of profiles like a Jalen McMillan, but maybe not. He's like the question mark in this comparison because I don't really know if he will be Jalen McMillan like this year. But the whole thing surrounding the Seattle Seahawks unit is that I think that Ryan Grubb will have very little trouble in having what he did with this University of Washington wide receiver room and have it translate to these guys because they do have very similar profiles. And going back to Splash Bros' comment about Geno, he also plays a big role. He did say in training camp, looking at Ryan Grubb and his playbook, that it was the most versatile offense he's seen. A lot of verbiage to it, a lot of different reads and a lot of different concept stuff that he says he personally has never been seeing in an NFL playbook ever. So that definitely speaks to, as Humanity Unbound says, very informative. I've subscribed. Thank you so much for the description. Hope you are enjoying this show so far. But like I said, Ryan Grubb is the X factor in terms of not just this wide receiver room, but the complexities of how he uses his wide receivers. I think DK, his production is not going to worry. It's that competition between Jaxon Smith-Njigba and Tyler Lockett that I'm really looking at this year. And also outside of the typical wide receivers, Jake Bobo, a lot of hype around him and the Seattle fan base. Maybe he could be one of those guys who can get more playing time. We always scream for more Bobo as a Seattle Seahawks fan after what he did last season. In terms of the tight end room, Noah Fant utilized a lot in Shane Waldron's system. Let's see if that translates to Ryan Grubb's system. The versatility of the Seattle Seahawks offense really excites me, but the questions are on the field. Let's see it in a true game. And I think that this week, a lot of you should pay attention to the Seattle wide receivers if you have them in your fantasy team, because that's the week where they set the standard for themselves. They face the Denver Broncos. That's a very nice little warm-up game for them, I suspect. And then they also face the New England Patriots. So they should prospectively be 2-0 with two very good teams in terms of matchups between wide receivers and corners they can exploit. But then they get tested in the middle half of the season. So I think that if you're a Seattle Seahawks wide receiver lover and you have one of them in your team, look at them early on in the season to have instant success. And it feels kind of weird for a first-year head coach and a first-year OC, but I think that's just the way it is. I feel like these guys in Seattle are starting to become more comfortable with the new profile. I know that Pete Carroll was very influential there, but they feel like they are ready for this new era, and I'm excited to see this. Go Hawks. Thank you guys for commenting on this segment. I really love talking about the Seattle Seahawks, and I really think that they're going to be an intriguing fantasy group this year. But coming next, we talk about one of the more, I don't want to use the word controversial, but I'm guessing it's starting to tend that way now, wide receiver groups in the league, but with the addition of one of the most tension-filled wide receivers in the league. We'll be right back to discuss them right after the break.